without further delay, we're going to jump in. We're going to be talking a little bit about automation tools and techniques, and a little bit about the space as it pertains to GRC, which to me is one of the more interesting elements of cybersecurity. You know, back in the old days, right, when I first got started, cybersecurity was all about attack and penetration, really about controls and countermeasures and basically deconstructing attacks and crafting mechanisms by which you could respond to those attacks. And so now in present day and age, when you've got here is a situation where that really accounts for about 50% of the cybersecurity market. When I talk about market, I mean not only the requirements of a cybersecurity professional, but also the skill set of cybersecurity professionals. And so on today's panel, I'm very, very pleased to welcome folks who, generally speaking, are focusing on this GRC element. We can talk a little bit about regulatory compliance. We can talk a little bit about audit readiness, the types of things that most of us in cybersecurity practice don't necessarily focus on when we see things in the news. For example, when you look up cybersecurity news, the first thing you're going to come up against is things like, oh, a breach here, a data loss here, a data leak there, stuff on the dark web, all the cool and freaky stuff that has given cybersecurity the prevalence in the media that it has. However, what you're not going to find is, hey, so-and-so passed an audit, right? So-and-so reached regulatory compliance. So-and-so reached ISO certification, which, by the way, is an enormous part of what we have to do and be concerned about as cybersecurity professionals. And examples of which, supply chain, right? Supply chain hacks, supply chain attacks. These are all very important concepts that are mitigated by processes and procedures in GRC. And so this is our panel. And so without further delay, my name is Ajay. I am the general manager for Rapid7 here in Canada. We're basically a cybersecurity products and services provider. And so, one of those circumstances where you might need advisory, you might need some sort of element of tooling to combat the cybersecurity threat, I'm the fellow to call. But less important, more important, are the panel of experts that I've had to join us today. And so I'm going to ask them one at a time to introduce themselves to you before we jump in to this exciting panel talking about GRC and, more importantly, gaining efficiencies by automating GRC. So I'm going to start with Stacey. So Stacey Romanello, maybe you could talk a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to our audience here today.
Absolutely. So I'm Stacey Romanello. I'm the Regional Information Security Officer for Royal Bank of Canada. And I've been automating processes since one of my first jobs at KPMG as an auditor. It was a Lenox Hill Hospital job they'd never automated before. And I actually found fraud during the audit, which they'd never found there. And I was definitely hooked on the whole idea of automation. To me, automation is all about finding problems and issues and enabling the stakeholders to better visualize where enhancements can be made. And so I love automation in every way, shape, or form.
I love automation in every way, shape, or form. That's not something you see on a greeting card. It's like, I love you, automation. We should have a holiday every year, February 15th. That's Automation Day. I love you, automation.
I like it.
Yeah, right? I mean, that'd be a great thing to have. All right, Mr. Davis, George Davis from Trend Micro.
Hey, I'm George Davis. I come from a cloud and DevOps background, but I worked extensively with software development, testing. I'm a cloud solutions architect with Trend Micro. I help customers build cybersecurity into their day-to-day activities, right from development all the way to production and having their systems secure and maintained on the cloud, as well as on data centers and everywhere else. Nice to be on the panel today.
It's nice to have you. Thanks for joining us, George. And then finally, last but certainly not least, DC, right? Dhruv, Chandra. We all had a brief poll earlier before this one. We all discussed it. And we all agree that Dhruv is the best looking member of our panel. So, we're happy to welcome you. I'm just kidding. You're all equally beautiful. Dhruv, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
First of all, I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. I'm working with Google, and prior to this, for past 20 years, I worked with almost every financial institution in the country. I come from a networking and security background, firewalls, switches, routers, and stuff like that, and then slowly moved into regulatory compliance, audit, second line of defense, first line of defense. And then in the past 7 years or so, between Scotia, Royal Bank, and now at Google, I started focusing on cloud. And my function at Google is a principal architect focused on security transformation, working with all the CISOs within Canada and outside Canada, doing some transformation and security automation per se, CSPM and tools such as those. And here I am, happy to answer any questions. And again, glad to be a part of this brilliant panel with George, Stacey, and you, Ajay.
It's our pleasure to welcome you as well. So let's just jump right in, right? So we talked in the preamble about how GRC is lesser known, but just as critically important to running any security program as, say, having proper pen testing in place or having proper security controls in place or vulnerability management, any of these well-known processes. So I'm going to start with you, Stacey. So the first question I have is, talk to me about some of the common challenges that you run across in either formulating a GRC program or executing a GRC program. What are the most common pitfalls or challenges or issues that you see rising up?
To me, there are two challenges that I find consistently, no matter what we do. The first is business engagement. Very often, business people start off believing that security is something that's done to them and not something they actually have to participate in doing, and in which they need to play an active role. And that is a very challenging situation because you have to explain to them that we're here to help, but it's not our job. They have the ownership and the responsibility, and they don't get to delegate that responsibility. And once they understand they're on the hook, they're much more willing to come to you as a business partner, because now they understand you're there to help them, not the other way around. The second big one for me is prioritization. Everything is important. Everything's a fire drill. Everything has to be done yesterday. And oh my goodness, we have a finding. And so it's really important to figure out what gets top billing and to understand that once you have action plans in place, they can kind of move to the bottom of the list because the action plan will play out. And so you really, from a governance and oversight perspective, have to worry about the things that don't have action plans, the ones that don't have something where we see an end date and where everyone knows what they're doing. So to me, those are the two most important pieces, the business engagement and the prioritization.
Yeah, and what we're really talking about there is accountability, right? Because you have to get somebody to stand up and own the program and own
Definitely.
the accountability of the program. I've often told, many of my customers in a consulting capacity that you need to have executive sponsorship and you need to have somebody at the exec or at the board level, right, responsible for cybersecurity. So Stacey, your point is extraordinarily well made. So thank you for helping us with that. And so I will hand this over to George. George, so Stacey made some great points about accountability, building a program, having adequate documentation. Talk to us about how automation can help this become a successful program.
Automation itself, I see automation more as a tool that can help the business to bridge a top-down approach where the board level wants to view what GRC is, what their current posture is, as well as a bottom-up approach, right? Where the operational team helps to digest that information and share that with the CXOs, right? So automation itself is more, for me, a framework where you can communicate better within the organization, where your risks are, where how your compliance status is. And it's more like a tool, in my opinion, especially continuously monitoring what's happening in your environment and getting that continuous assurance that everything is still in compliance. That is a great tool to have. And capturing that data accurately as we build on the cloud, that is something that is crucial when it comes to maintaining GRC. And I see automation more as a tool to enable that.
So I'm going to stick with you, George, because you made a good point there. Can you give us some examples of a program that you've seen or run or contributed to where automation has achieved exactly what you've just talked about?
Yeah, I can speak from experience on that. So I previously worked for a large telecom, and as part of that, we had a problem where we were not able to understand where data resides, right? And gathering that sort of information had to come from 3 different levels. One being people doing their day-to-day mapping data classification, stuff like that. Process where we then take in saying, okay, this is where the data is, and this is what the data needs to go through the data lifecycle. as well as technology, where technology helps us identify, hey, this is where you are at right now, and this is where you want to be, right? So making sure confidential data is still intact and is in the right compliance environment. Your risks are covered in that particular environment, and catering to every single environment, like dev, stage, and production differently, right? Making sure that you have a common posture right from dev all the way to production, but making sure that the right controls are put in place such that you also have a linear growth and linear build towards when you go production. The more earned confidence, that's what we say, the better, right? So that's something that I think automation can help build that earned confidence as you go through that pipeline, establish security measures as well as controls, and making sure they all work together.
Excellent. Thanks, George. And so Dhruv, George talked about building confidence in a program, right? And so there's several stakeholders, and I'm not going to talk about them because I'm sure you have more to say about that than I do. There are several stakeholders who are going to be responsible for obviously implementing, funding, deploying this program, but it comes back to George's point about confidence. How do you get confidence in a program? How do you get some key considerations together and get the stakeholders together for building a program that's resilient? So how do you get people to kind of buy in is the question, because that's going to be a big obstruction to building out a GRC program. And then we'll talk about automation in a second, but let's talk about just building the program and getting everybody together to be confident in the program.
So with regards to the program, I wanted to jump on the automation side, but let's leave automation aside.
We'll get there.
We'll get there, right? With regards to how the program works, I think the first crucial hurdle to overcome is collaboration and education. Because what I have noticed and seen in a number of organizations, even with the best intent, there is no cohesion between the first line of defense, the second line of defense, the third line of defense. Sometimes they speak different languages. The cloud engineering team speaks a very different language from the second line of defense. The second line of defense speaks a very different language from the third line of defense. The challenge function, the audit function. And if you don't bring these people together, and you can only bring these people together via a common nomenclature or a common language, which is the language which we will talk about, since you've told me not to use the word automation. But that cohesion, that approach, that handshake outside these silos will make life far more easier, along with the layer of education from ground up, because you can't develop such programs in silos.
Okay, so now automation is not a bad word. Now you've gotten buy-in from all the stakeholders. Okay, we need to do this. We need to deploy a program. We need to have this resiliency in place. How then do you move ahead with automation? What do you automate first? What do you prioritize? Tell me where you tend to point your guns as it pertains to automation. Dhruv, I'm going to stay with you on this one.
So now that we are on the subject of automation, so automation certainly is a tool, certainly is a process, but more than that, it is also a mindset. And when I say mindset, shifting security to the left, understanding what has changed in the infrastructure, what has changed in the technology stack, and how automation or scripting or whatever you call it will make efficiencies come to you rather than driving efficiencies. And that is where automation comes into the picture. A simple example would be, instead of a push function, which is an internal auditor coming to your desk and saying, okay, Dhruv, you have to do this, and you have to provide me 1,600 reports over a period of 4 years that you've been working on this. And these things happen. I'm not exaggerating. When OSFI comes in, when internal audit individuals come in, when the challenge function comes in, which is the second line of defense, you have to leave aside your real-time work and start focusing on how to satisfy the audit. That should be a push function, and that push function can be done via exposing CSPM tools to your second line of defense and the third line of defense. And a lot of mature organizations are actually doing so. Cloud engineering team are doing whatever they need to do, but a part of the CSPM tool is actually exposed to the second line and the third line of defense, where they actually can extract information. They can define policies and constraints and, black box certain environment, make sure that there is drift detection and drift reporting and drift prevention. And all of that, and again, when we spoke about the first part of the conversation between you and I, Ajay, and the team, it's a mindset and bringing people together. Once you actually link all these things together, do an automation, expose technologies and tools that cloud engineering team uses. And I keep going back to cloud because I think automation is very close to cloud, and I think it is actually percolating into the existing infrastructure too, because a lot of environment is now OCP, OpenShift, PCF, on-prem technologies, Anthos, and so on and so forth. So I think collectively, if we do this, your automation will increase efficiencies, increase your time to market, reduce the touch points that people have, reduce the error rates, and of course, create better collaboration.
You brought forth three great terms, and I want to expand on all of them because one, you talked about shifting left, which is a big concept as it pertains to not only automation in DevOps, which is the second term I wanted to bring up because we didn't drill into this enough. And then the third one is CSPM, which for everybody is cloud security posture management, right? So these are this is tooling that's going to iteratively and constantly ensure that your cloud security postures are being maintained, or whatever your policies are being maintained. It's a key automation component to maintaining, I guess, cloud compliance, right? So with that, we're going to talk about DevOps because this is a very, very interesting topic to me. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, Rapid7, we make CSPM tools. And so that's why I'm going to drill into this concept. And so we'll go back to you, Stacey, on the DevOps conversation. First things first, shifting left, right? Getting as early in the development cycle as possible to build automation and resiliency. Tell me about that shift. Is it happening? What's preventing it from happening? Or what is pushing it to happen? What are the drivers as well as the counter drivers for this shift left as it pertains to automation for DevOps?
So I think the biggest driver is not to have to redo stuff. So if you tell me after we finish building something that I've got a security issue, that's a big deal, right? I have to rethink everything I've just built. If you tell me at the very beginning that here's a list of the things I have to consider, and if while I'm building my code, you're actually catching problems with it, that's a huge win. And it's an amazing time saver. So to us, doing that automation and putting all that stuff up front and making sure that we're giving advice as people go along means that there are no surprises at the end, which is better for everybody.
George, I want you to weigh in on what are some of the drivers and obstacles to making that shift left, as well as how you see a CSPM being involved, or what role a CSPM could or should be playing in that shift.
Yeah, I fully agree with Stacey on that. Bringing in security as we build is very important, especially for the development side of the business, right? And bringing that CSPM closer to where they are is very crucial. That's one of the main reasons. Like CSPMs, we are looking at more of integration. As much integration as possible, as early as possible, which is the shift left paradigm, right? And making sure that the output also is part of their workflow, right? If a mature CSM should be able to integrate with where the developers are, maybe Slack, maybe Teams, or even Jira, right? If they are working out of a Jira Kanban board, if we can have security built into that and say, hey, the last cycle that you guys deployed had this sort of a vulnerability, and so we blocked that pipeline. You have to go ahead and rework on that, right? That really helps. Also building tooling into your development workflow, right? As you develop, if there are plugins CSPMs offer where you can simply, as you develop infrastructure as code, you can now scan for that and say, hey, these are my high risks. These are my extremely high risks, and these are what I need to shot down before I can push this into a dev environment. And that is something that we can set with CI/CD pipelines, having like control checks as we go. So the developer then gets into a flow of, hey, I'm building software secure by design, right? And that is a place where we want to get with CSPM, make it transparent, as well as make it omnipresent across the entire pipeline, that it doesn't become an extra activity, but it gets blended into a regular day-to-day activity.
So you mentioned CI/CD. That's very, very close and near and dear to my heart. Like I said, we do a lot of work in there. For everybody on this audience or everyone in the panel, continuous integration, continuous deployment, or I think it could stand for something else. But the one I've learned is integration and continuous deployment. This is basically representative of an evolution in software development models from things like I don't know if anybody remembers the waterfall model of software development. Old people like me, right? Computer science school and computer engineering school, like that's what it was. You had the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, and you kind of just went through all these steps, right? And now it's not about that at all. It's like your software is constantly being integrated, the modules are constantly being updated, and you've got these sprints, right? And you're just pushing them out the front door, basically same day, same week. And so huge paradigm shift in software development. CI/CD is an incredible trend. Dhruv, tell me what your experience has been with CI/CD, as well as a shift, that shift we just discussed, right? From a waterfall to kind of like a DevOps model, and what impact that has had on automation and testing. We didn't talk about testing. I was going to save that till the end, but we've only got 8 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure we caught the test methodologies as well. So Dhruv, I'd love to hear your perspective on CI/CD, the shift towards DevOps from waterfall, and what this means for testing. You might want to get yourself off mute there, bro.
That's a good point.
I'm here to help. That's what I do. Add value.
So with regards to CI/CD, again, that paradigm is fantastic, but it is very little understood by the entire organization. And that's where the challenges come in. You know, your existing processes talk about change management, segregation of duty. How do you ensure segregation of duty on CI/CD pipeline? Sometimes it takes away accountability and responsibility from certain teams, right? So let's say I'm doing infrastructure and there's a network component and there's a firewall component and there's a policy component. Who does what, when, and how, and where? Who owns control on that? And then it becomes furthermore convoluted that you may have one singular CI/CD pipeline, which is an infrastructure and security CI/CD pipeline. On top of that, you have application CI/CD pipeline. On top of that, you have data ingestion CI/CD pipeline. How do you separate and segregate all of those? That becomes a challenging conversation, splitting hairs, and again, educating the team members from Chief Data Office to Chief Information Security Office to the Cloud Engineering Office. I think that is where understanding what CI/CD pipeline is and how to map it down into your current change management is really important. One of the other challenges I've seen in the CI/CD pipeline is actually, let's talk about an example that is near and dear to my heart. You know, how these CI/CD pipelines facilitate between CI/CD pipelines, CSPM tools, how do they facilitate faster move to the market? Generally, what happens in any initiative is that an initiative takes place and architecture is drawn. It goes through a risk assessment service, and that risk assessment service can be relatively long. And risk assessment done by George Davis and Dhruv Chandra is slightly different because we come from a very different opinions. And opinionated risk assessment is horrible because it changes every time you go into it. So that's where Stacey's statement comes into the picture, which is making sure what is automated, you don't have to repeat it. If you automate risk assessment within your CI/CD pipeline, within reporting in this CSPM dashboard, life becomes much more easier. And risk assessment becomes faster and quicker and on the fly rather than a batch process on the side, right? So this is where I think all these things come together. So that was the first part of the question. What was your second question, Ajay?
Testing. It was about the value of testing, automated testing. and where?
That's fantastic, and that is so cool about if you've played around with CI/CD pipeline, you can actually automate your inception, your testing, your auto remediation and auto healing, and only once all the checks come out green on your CI/CD pipeline do you actually move into production. You can actually take away from existing deployment. If some deployment fails, it can auto heal and remediate by going back to the existing well-known setup, right? So I love that about CI/CD pipeline. And I know that these terms are relatively heavy because people are not exposed to it, but once you start playing with it, you realize that there is a certain degree of simplicity. And all you need to do is just start diving into it. And I promise, like, it is not as convoluted. If I can understand a bit of it, I'm certain everybody else can understand a bit of it.
I like how you describe CI/CD as straightforward, because I haven't actually been able to get anybody to explain CI/CD to me in a straightforward way.
I think because
different people.
Because I think human tendency is to convolute things, right? So and we have a term in security: the simpler it is, the more secure it is, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that context, Dhruv. Stacey, I want to come back to you and get your views on that evolution that we talked about from just say a waterfall to a DevOps model, and the role of CI/CD and testing from your perspective, because I'm sure you've had, coming from RBC, there's so much legacy code. There's got to be a ton of legacy code that's being maintained or not maintained, being maintained and developed, and in a traditional sense. And now, bam, we're pushing this to the cloud. Now you're talking about CI/CD test and CSPM. So love to hear your perspectives on that evolution.
So RBC has a very conservative approach to using the cloud. We don't have a cloud first approach. We have a cloud ready approach. So we make sure that before something is going to be put into the cloud, that it really is appropriate for the cloud. And we've got lots of risk assessments and analysis in place around that. Going back to your point about legacy systems, sure. And we all grew up with waterfall, or most of us grew up with waterfall. RBC adopted Agile very early on. And offered many training classes to move the developers into that mindset. So even if we were doing semi-waterfall because not everyone was caught up, we were doing, somewhat of an agile process. So it really fits nicely with trying to make sure that you've got the right security controls in place up front, and making sure that you're doing the right testing in order to make sure everything is working as you go on, and not where you get to the end and go big bang and all of a sudden everything crashes and burns. So as you said, it's particularly important for legacy.
And I'm not letting you off the hook with that comment. So you talked about crash and burn. I don't want a specific example, but tell me about how a program, specifically a GRC program pertaining to a development environment, does crash and burn. Like, again, not specifics, but tell me how things break and where they break and how badly they've broken based on what you've just said.
It usually breaks when people aren't kept in the loop. When you've got somebody who's individually going off and trying to do something where they have their head down and they're not seeing the forest because they're so focused on that tree and the seeds that are underneath that tree. And that's when they kind of forget about everything else that's around them, and it winds up really going sideways quickly. And what you hope is you've got good people surrounding that person who say, hey, wait a second, hold up. and that's why developers usually work in teams.
Well, I know two other good people. So we've got a minute left in this panel. So we're going to do a lightning answer. And I'm going to start with you, George. And it's the same question I'm going to ask all three of you. What is the single most important piece of advice you can give somebody who's going to be automating in the cloud the program going forward? George, we'll start with you. Single most important piece of advice.
Form a forum within the organization. We call it a cloud center of excellence. Form that, and that's going to help make sure that you meet the business needs while checking off all the technical objectives. So look into cloud center of excellence. That might be a more collaborative approach to security and will still help the organization as well.
Thank you. Dhruv, your best pro tip.
My best statement would be, don't reinvent the wheel. every cloud service provider, Google specifically, and others too, we have full framework. And you can go to any of these cloud service providers' public sites and say that I want a full framework. I want all GitHub repository, all code, all security best practices, and I want it codified. Do you have something like that? And Google has something called Google Security Cloud Foundations. Full Terraform code is there. And you can pick that up, start off with a small example bank application.
Day one.
On the fly in matter of minutes, not hours, in matter of minutes. And you can move this code around. You can curate it according to yourself. And it completes your entire security stack from ground to the very top, satisfying your privacy requirements, satisfying your DLP requirements on the fly. It's all there. And I'm certain that it's all there with other cloud service providers.
So think out of the box by using out of the box.
It's all there. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't spend hundreds of hours trying to create a framework or map it to standards or what have you. It's already pre-done for you.
Amazing tip. Thank you, Dhruv. And Stacey, last certainly not least, your biggest and best pro tip.
I like what Dhruv said about start small. Don't go for the big thing. Get it working first. Make sure you understand your business requirements. Don't be so caught up in building something in the cloud that you actually miss the business goal.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, all of you. I want to take a moment to recognize our panelists for the excellent contribution that they have made to this panel. Folks, it's been a true pleasure working with you, and everybody, audience out there, thank you very much for participating in this panel. I hope it was useful for you. Feel free to follow up with all of us, any of us out of band. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. I've got a big mouth and I like to use it. So by all means, feel free. I want to thank again the panelists. I want to wish everybody the best out there. I hope everybody's doing great, staying well, staying healthy, having fun. Everybody have a fantastic day, and we'll see you out there. Thanks, everyone on the panel.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.